Hi, Dad. Can you give us an introduction of you and tell us your job title at EA?
Sure, Jackson. So my name is Eric Chrisman, and I am a senior engineering manager at Electronic Arts.
So, what credentials do you have?
So I have a bachelor's degree in computer engineering that I got from the University of Central Florida, go Knights. And I have been working in the game industry for about 15 years now. I started out as a software engineer. I've worked my way up to being a technical director, and now I am a senior engineering manager, which means that I have a team of about 10 engineers that report to me, and we're responsible for doing character technology development in the Frostbite engine.
And what games have you helped to make?
So when I started at Electronic Arts about 15 years ago, I was on the Tiger Woods game franchise, so golf. So I shipped 3 titles of Tiger Woods, and then I moved on to what they call central teams. So I helped develop technology that goes into multiple games. So in that capacity, I've also helped ship FIFA, Madden, Battlefield, NHL, UFC, and am I forgetting anything? Plants vs. Zombies, and I think that's about it.
Have you ever worked with young or relatively inexperienced peers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually we do quite a bit of work with what we call interns or co-op students. So those are people who are pursuing a degree, say in computer science or computer engineering in college, and they think that they might be interested in the game industry. So what we do is we interview them, we hire them. They typically come to work for us over a summer, and we treat them just like we would any other engineer on the team, just with less experience. So we help them get started in the game industry and learn what they can about game development while they're there, typically for 4 months or so. And then they go back to school, and then hopefully they come back and work for us when they graduate.
What game engine do you/EA use?
So most of our games at EA are developed on the Frostbite engine, which is an internal proprietary game engine that we've developed ourselves. So that's actually the team that I work on, is the Frostbite team. But we do also ship some games on Unreal. So for example, the Apex Legends is developed on Unreal. And then on our mobile games, we have another proprietary engine that we use for development.
Is there a list of steps you should take when developing a game?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, video game development is a pretty complicated process. So when you're developing a game, you have to think about, say, the tools that you're going to use in order to get art assets into the game. So say you're creating a 3D shooter, right? Then you're going to want all of the assets for your environments and your characters, and figure out how you're going to get those from a content creator tool, like say Maya or Houdini or something, into the game. So you need what they call an art pipeline, an asset pipeline, to get those into some format that they can actually be used by whatever game engine you're going to be using. And then you actually have to figure out what the gameplay is going to be like. So you have to write the code that would manage the gameplay. So again, if you're talking about a shooter, then you need to be able to translate those individual key presses on your controller into something that's happening in the game and figure out how you can move around. And then also another piece of it is the graphics and rendering, right? So that's very important because a lot of times, those visualizations of the game are what people remember about the game. So in the first-person shooter, like in Battlefield, right? When you shoot something and you see it explode, or the particle effects and things like that, those are all effects that are generated by, say, a rendering engineer on the game. So you have to figure out what your rendering fidelity is going to be like, what kind of frame rate you're looking for, so all the code and metrics that go into that. And then also, I think the last step is the presentation. So you have to think about the look and feel of the game, and figure out what the cameras are going to so the user interface for the game. So are you going to have a menuing system? Are you going to jump right into a level and start playing? Are there going to be cutscenes? So kind of the cinematics and the presentation that make a game feel like an experience.
How do you develop an idea into something realistic and achievable?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, as you can imagine, you can think of amazing ideas for games, and you might have a vision, say with today's modern video and graphics cards, you could have photorealistic characters inside of this beautiful ray-traced lighted domain, and say you wanted to make that into a shooter, but you have to figure out how that could actually work in runtime in a game. So all of those high fidelity assets they take up a lot of memory, and they're super slow to render on the screen. So you might be able to create something that looked beautiful, but the frame rate is 2 frames per second or 3 frames per second. It's not going to be any fun to play. So there's always that balance and trade-off, and a lot of that comes from experience in making games. So you experiment, you prototype things, you figure out, okay, I have this asset. If I run it in the game, is that going to A, look good, and B, is it going to be a fun experience? So there are all kinds of constraints when making a game, mainly around performance, right? Around what's going to be fun to play. And so when you're trying to take something from just an idea into something realistic, you have to experiment, prototype, figure out what works, and then pick a direction and go forward with the assets and things that are going to make for the most enjoyable experience.
How would you increase the frame rate on a game if it was laggy?
Yeah, so there are actually engineers at EA whose entire job is to figure out how to get more performance out of the game. So there are actually tools that we can use to highlight when you're running the game where exactly the slowdown is, and whether the slowdown is on what we call the sim side, so like on the CPU, on the console or on the PC, or whether it's on the GPU, so like say on the rendering or the graphics side of things. So once you kind of pinpoint where the problem is, then you can start digging into the code to get a better idea of where the actual slowdowns are, right? So sometimes the issue is maybe some inefficiency in an algorithm in the code, right? So possibly somewhere in the rendering engine, say it's rendering 3D grass, and it's maybe rendering stuff that isn't actually in the camera view at the time, right? So if you discovered that, then you could do what they call culling, so that you're only rendering things that are visible on the screen at the time, and you might get a performance boost out of that. Or the problem might be that the assets that are being used are taking up too much horsepower to render. So say in some characters, they're using what we call strand hair, right? So you're rendering every single strand of their hair somewhat individually so that it moves realistically. But maybe on a mobile platform or on a PC that has, not as high end of a PC, it doesn't have enough horsepower to render that. So maybe in that case you need to scale it down to just being what they call card hair. So basically just an image of some hair that is much easier to render on the resources on the computer. So there's a variety of different techniques for pinpointing those issues and where the problem can be. So it's actually a super important part of the game development process. So great question.
What kind of game would you recommend young developers to make?
Yeah, so I think that probably something that has relatively easy art assets in it, because as software engineers, we're typically not artists when we're making games. But at EA, we have whole teams of artists that work on the assets for the game. But if you're young developers and you're making a game on your own, like an independent game, then you're you're going to want something that's going to be relatively easy. So I would say maybe something like a 2D platformer, relatively simple art that you could get into the game and not too complicated on physics and things like that.
What form would be best for a guide that teaches people how to develop a game?
Yeah, so I think for me, the best format would be some sort of digital format, like a website or something. Internally, all of our documentation, for the most part, because we also have to learn about different parts of the game and how they work when we're developing them internally. So we usually use websites for that. Videos embedded in the website for maybe showing how to use a tool or something like that. I think is a fantastic way to communicate that information.